my name's Emily Spavin and I'm UK News Editor here at LinkedIn. I'm joined today by Kim Sartin and Julia Wilson. They're employment law experts from the law firm Baker McKenzie. LinkedIn's editorial team has been extensively covering the coronavirus crisis over the past couple of months. Members on the platform have been discussing all sorts of topics relating to this, ranging from the personal to the professional. But one topic area that I've seen coming up time and time again focuses on the government support packages and what exactly is on offer and who qualifies. So today we're going to be looking specifically at one of those schemes, and that's the Coronavirus Job Retention Scheme. So thank you very much for joining me, Kim and Julia. Perhaps we could start off by you giving us a brief summary of that scheme.
Yeah, no problem. So the scheme was launched by the government in March and effectively allows employers to reclaim 80% of employees' wage costs from the government for furloughed workers. And that's workers who they've had to send home because there's no work for them, for example. Now, the scheme was originally open for 3 months from the 1st of March, but actually the government has recently announced that has been extended for a further month. So it's now open for 4 months, ending at the end of June. And because this has all been created sort of on the hoof, as it were, this whole scheme, there have been many iterations of guidance that we've been seeing coming out from the government. So I think now we're on our 5th iteration of the guidance. And what that has meant is that there have been lots of questions that have been unanswered, and they are slowly being answered, but actually some grey areas still remain. And so we've been working with a lot of clients to try and help them navigate this as the guidance is being updated so that they can work with their employees to understand exactly how the scheme works.
Okay, fantastic. And so recently I asked you to post on LinkedIn asking members on the platform to share their questions on this scheme. And we've had a great response. I've seen there's a couple of hundred comments on that post now. But it seems like there are a few particular areas that people are specifically interested in or have some concerns about. So perhaps if we go through some of those on the call today. So the first one that I've noted down, a lot of people have been asking about whether they're allowed to work while they're on furlough, be that for their current employer or for someone else.
Yeah, and the guidance has been very clear on this, and they've said, look, you can't work for your employer. So providing services or generating revenue for your employer or an associated employer. And there are a lot of questions around that, because how much work do you need to do to be able to trip up on that? Because actually, if you do work, it means that you're disqualified from the scheme. And so there's a real grey area around this. So we've had questions from people saying, actually, but what if I'm a key holder and I need to go to the premises and take in a delivery? Or actually, what about connecting with people on social media or keeping in touch with people on LinkedIn? Is that work or isn't it? And actually, that's something that there is no de minimis exception at the moment. So there seems to be a very clear line that says either you're working or you're not working. The only thing that is permissible is training. So there is a provision saying absolutely you can do training during a period of furlough. And so at least that is clear. But as I say, there still is quite a lot of uncertainty about what actually does constitute work and whether de minimis work would fall foul of that restriction or not.
And so what should someone do if they have been furloughed and they're being asked to work by their employer?
I mean, I think in the first instance, they should be putting up their hand and saying to their employer, actually, I've been furloughed and my understanding is that actually I shouldn't be doing any work for you. I mean, actually, in some ways, the issue is more one for the employer, because if the employer is asking someone who they have ostensibly furloughed to do some work, then actually it's the employer who won't be able to recover the money from the government under the scheme. So I guess in that situation, it's probably a case of, the person putting up their hand saying, is this right? And flagging it to their employer, who can then take a view. And then if they say, well, actually, it turns out that I need you to do some work, then the employer should be taking that person off furlough and putting them to work in the usual way.
Okay, fantastic. The second question I've seen come up a few times is whether it centres on redundancies. So if an employer has made an employee redundant, can they rehire them and put them on furlough, or what are the rules around that?
What the guidance tells us is that if you were in employment on the payroll on the 28th of February but have subsequently been let go, your employer can re-employ you and put you on furlough in order to claim for the scheme. But lots of employers are refusing to do that, and I suppose it's probably worth unpacking why that is the case. because I think there's a few key reasons as to why an employer might not want to. So the first of those is that actually employing someone on furlough isn't cost neutral for the employer. There are certain costs that continue when someone is employed. Statutory holiday continues to accrue during furlough, so that's obviously an ongoing cost. Often somebody, the way that headcount is accounted for within a business just counts as a fixed cost in and of itself. And in fact, if you extend benefits, sort of non-contractual benefits such as medical care and the like, to your employees, again, that's a cost that continues. So first item is it's not cost-free for an employer. The second point is that actually employers might want to avoid their employees gaining, for instance, 2 complete years service, which gives them some sort of enhanced rights, including particular protection against dismissal. So for particularly short-serving employees, an employer might just want to avoid the hassle factor of somebody perhaps re-employing somebody, them gaining the full 2 years service, and then the employer's ability to terminate them with perhaps some more ease is then hampered. And then there's sort of a final point, which is that, as Kim's already alluded to, there's a lot of uncertainty about the scheme. So actually there's a certain hassle factor for the employer in trying to avail itself of the scheme in the first place, and a degree of uncertainty as to the operation of the scheme. And given that also employers will have concerns about cash flow in this period, often they'll be paying out to the furlough pay before they receive the grant from the government. Actually, you can imagine a lot of employers who are really feeling the pinch in this scenario will not want to take on the additional hassle factor of claiming a potential uncertainty as to when and if they'll get the grant. So it does result in some seemingly feeling very unfair outcomes. You alluded to it, Emily. There's some people who perhaps are just sort of falling through the gaps in the scheme here, but those are some of the reasons why.
For someone who has been made redundant, what would you say would be the best steps to kind of trying to get access to the furlough scheme?
I mean, to get access to the furlough scheme, the only thing they can do is seek to engage with their employer about about being re-employed and furloughed. I mean, are there things that an employee could offer to make it simpler for the the employer to agree to? Unfortunately, the way the scheme is set up, it is possibly not. So for instance, someone might say, will you re-employ me and furlough me, and I'll agree I won't get paid the furlough grant until you get it, or I might waive my right to statutory holiday. Well, a couple of things there. One, it seems to be from the Treasury direction on the scheme that actually you have to be paying out the furlough in order to qualify to claim it back. So I think making the furlough payment conditional upon receipt of the grant isn't going to work technically. The point about waiver of statutory holidays, actually you couldn't do that unless you did it through a settlement agreement, which has its own complications and costs associated with it. So unfortunately, actually, I think the most that you can do is play to your employer's internal moral compass that they are willing to sort of take on the hassle factor, or try and encourage them to do so. But unfortunately, it's limited options otherwise.
Okay, thank you. And you touched there upon statutory holiday. So one of the questions that's come up a few times is around that subject of annual leave. What are the rules around this? Can people take annual leave while they're on furlough? How much will they get paid if they are allowed to take this? Perhaps you could answer that one for me.
Yeah, sure. So I'll take that one. And I'm glad that we're having this conversation now rather than when the guidance wasn't so clear, because actually the position until very recently was very unclear on this. And in fact, it was completely silent on it, which meant that employers were facing the situation where they were thinking, well, I don't know whether employees should be taking their holiday. And if they do take that holiday and it breaks the minimum 3-week furlough period, does that then mean that I can't claim for that period? And equally for individuals, they were thinking, well, actually, I want to be able to take a period of holiday, but my employer might be saying, no, I can't because, they're breaking the 3-week period issue. So now there has been some clarity provided by the guidance, which basically says that it's certainly clear that if an employee wants to take holiday, that doesn't break the period of furlough for the purposes of the government scheme. And it seems also clear that an employer has their usual right to vary the timing of the holiday if they need to for business reasons. So if it doesn't work for the business for an employee to take leave at a particular time, in the usual way, an employer can say, well, actually, I'd rather you didn't take it then. Can you take it at this point instead? Whether an employer can require an employee to take holiday during furlough is not explicitly referenced in the guidance, but we think the position should be that actually employers can require employees to take annual leave during furlough in the same way that an employee can take annual leave during furlough if they choose to do so. So as I say, the guidance isn't 100% explicit on that, but that's what we think the position should be and would make the most sense. I mean, obviously, if an employer wanted to be very safe about that and they did want people to take holiday and they weren't prepared to take the risk, and assuming again that we don't get any more iterations of the guidance, which we may do, what they could, of course, think about is at the end of the furlough period, designating a period of leave at that point, because employers have the right to require employees to take annual leave provided they've given a certain period of notice. So they could decide to put that right at the end, and then we don't have the issue with it breaking the furlough period. So in relation to whether we might get more guidance about this, the government has explicitly said in the guidance that they're keeping the position on holiday pay under review. So I think if there is another area where we can expect a bit more detail, it's probably this one. So obviously looking at the holiday pay, looking at the people taking holiday, then obviously the natural question then is, well, what do people get paid while they're on holiday? Is it just the furlough pay? Is it the 80%? Is it something else? And again, it seems that we've got some clarity on this now, that for the 5.6 weeks of statutory leave that people are entitled to in the UK if they're a full-time worker, that they get paid their full pay. So obviously, if an employer's gone down to the 80% under the furlough scheme, then actually if someone's taking holiday, it seems to us that they have the right to full pay during that period. But if an employer provides additional holiday on top of that, 5.6 weeks, then actually it's open to the employer as part of a variation in discussions with employees as part of the furlough to agree to do something different at that point. So at least we're getting some clarity here. It looks like people can take holiday without it impacting on the furlough, and it also looks like people should be getting full pay.
Another question that we've had a few people asking centres around maternity leave and paternity leave. So there are a few different types of question on this, so maybe we could just talk about it as a topic as a whole. But one of the questions was around, can people on maternity leave be furloughed, and what are the implications?
Yeah, perfect. Let me take that one. So the guidance, right from we sort of first got guidance on this, indicated that employees on maternity leave could be furloughed. Now we then got a sort of what's called the direction, which has sort of slightly more legal force, if you will, about the furlough scheme. And that introduced this concept of people on unpaid leave. That might be any kind of family type of leave, including maternity leave, might be unpaid sick leave, etc. But anyone who's on unpaid leave cannot be furloughed until they return from that unpaid leave on the date that had been agreed beforehand. That it was naturally to end. And so I think what that's created is a bit of a dichotomy between employees, in particularly in the maternity space. Lots of employees take 52 weeks leave, that's their statutory leave entitlement, but in fact, if they've qualified for statutory maternity pay, then actually the maximum period for which they'll receive statutory maternity pay is 39 weeks. So there's quite often a window in which there's no pay. And it seems that the impact of this direction is that actually anyone who's in that unpaid period can't be furloughed until the date that they were intending to come back. But for anyone else who is on any kind of paid furlough, paid leave, then there are a couple of issues. So the first is the employer can claim back enhanced maternity pay contributions, but not statutory maternity pay contributions. Now that's a bit of a weird one, because it seems to, that provision seems to operate a bit independently from the provisions around furlough generally. It just seems to operate as a means of an employer recovering some of the sort of enhanced costs of somebody being off on a form of leave. It also does, you know, it envisages that employees on maternity leave can be placed on furlough, and therefore, you know, what's the interplay between maternity leave and furlough? It's not entirely clear. Does putting somebody on furlough end their maternity leave such that when the furlough period ends, they'd be required to return to work? Again, not clear. We think that may well be what's intended.
So could an employee who's on maternity leave ask their employer to come back early so that they could benefit from the furlough scheme?
So not only do people who are considering asking to come back from maternity leave have to think about the implications of what that means for them, and that they might actually end up coming back to work sooner than they might have otherwise planned to. There's also a question of what do they get paid for that furlough. Now, when the scheme was first launched, sort of women's rights action group Maternity Action raised serious questions about what women who had recently been on maternity leave with reduced earnings would get paid for a period of furlough, and whether in fact it would look at that sort of lower SMP or perhaps reduced enhanced maternity rate. And there has been a sort of welcome clarification in the guidance that in fact essentially you would not look at that reduced period of pay, you would look at what the sort of normal pay would be for that period. Now, does an employer have to furlough somebody who is on maternity leave? Very similar to this question of people who've been made redundant. No, an employer is not obliged to put a woman who's on maternity leave on furlough. A woman can ask to end their maternity leave early. Now, normally, if you want to end your maternity leave earlier than you'd planned, you need to give at least 8 weeks' notice. Your employer might be willing to waive that requirement for notice or allow a much reduced notice in order to put you on furlough, but that is, again, a discussion for them. And coming back to the point I raised earlier about people who've recently been made redundant, you know, there are reasons why your employer might not want to do that. They're already administering SMP through a scheme which they have, you know, had to operate through payroll. They might not want to have to switch gears onto a more complicated and new scheme, such as the furlough scheme.
Okay, thank you. And so those are the main 4 topics that seem to come up time and time again within the comment stream. Were there any other topics or questions that you noticed within the Q&A that you did that you'd like to speak a bit more to now, or any other themes that kept cropping up?
One of the things that I saw was people asking about whether the £2,500 furlough payment that they could expect is subject to deductions for tax and national insurance. And that was a theme that came up a few times, and the short answer to that is yes. So the 2,500 is a gross figure, and then from that will be deducted normal tax and national insurance contributions. And also, if someone is a member of their employer's pension scheme and signed up to that scheme, then they will need to be making pension contributions, at least the mandatory minimum pension contribution from that payment as well.
A lot of the posts seem to be from people who are in self-employed arrangements and are asking what the scheme is, and there is a separate self-employed scheme that seeks to operate, I think, in a similar way. I think, as Kim has already said in the posts, that's probably a discussion for another day, because the eligibility requirements are quite different from the employment scheme. But yes, there is another scheme, but for self-employed earners, it's something they're going to have to administer for themselves. That isn't something, they don't have another party, i.e. an employer, to help administer it for them. And then there seem to be a number of questions from people who talked variously about being self-employed, but also employed by umbrella companies. If you are in that situation, well, there's a first question, which is, what are you employed or not? And I think you need to be reaching out to whoever you're contracting with and trying to get to the bottom of that, and identifying, if you are employed, who is your employer. Sorry, that sounds a little bit obvious, but it's only your employer who can make a claim through this scheme. So if you're in fact providing services to an end user client in a sort of complex contracting scenario, the end user client can't make the claim for you, and so they're not the right person necessarily, or the right entity to be reaching out to. So actually, it's key to identify who your employer is, and then speak to them directly about what their intentions are in relation to furlough.
And I think one other point that has come up is about people who are employed by overseas legal entities. So I've seen a couple of questions from people saying, well, actually, I'm employed by a US company, or a company in Asia, and I've been told that I can't access the scheme. And there are a number of eligibility requirements to for an employer to access the scheme. And one of them is that they have their own PAYE scheme set up in the UK. So it's worthwhile for those individuals contacting their employer, assuming they are, employees and not independent contractors, and understanding if they do have a PAYE scheme set up in the UK, they might be able to find that information on their payslip, which might have the PAYE number on it, but at least asking that question initially, because that is sort of the initial hurdle they need to get over in order to be, in theory, able to access the scheme.
One final point from me, at least, is in relation to questions people are asking about whether they can be required to return to work from furlough. So some people have been furloughed, their employers maybe are seeing an unexpected uptick in activity, which means they maybe don't need to furlough their employees for as long as originally anticipated, and often with employees understandably having some reticence about coming back to work, health and safety concerns obviously being key. I suppose there's sort of a couple of things I would note there. First of all, the minimum furlough period is 3 weeks. Kim mentioned that at the outset. So if your employer was looking to end it sooner than that, they would be depriving themselves of the opportunity to claim for the grant. That's the first point. That doesn't seem to be the main point here, though. The main point tends to be that employees are concerned about health and safety in the workplace. Now, in ordinary circumstances, if your employer has ended furlough and has asked you to come back to work, then you will be, unless they've somehow contractually committed to not requiring you to come back before a particular date, then they can typically require you to come back to work. If you have genuine concerns about health and safety, you need to raise them quickly with your employer. There is some limited protection under employment law where you sort of reasonably see a serious and imminent danger in the workplace that would permit you not to return to work, and that not be a disciplinary offence effectively. But for your employer to be able to address them, you're going to have to speak to them about what your concerns are. And actually, in the last few weeks, we've seen some quite detailed guidance for businesses who are still operational on how they, best practices for maintaining a safe workplace that deal with not just how you sort of address social distancing within the workplace, but also shifts, staggering, and the like. And so if you think that your employer isn't necessarily taking on board all of that guidance, or at least hasn't reassured you enough that they are, then it's legitimate to raise those questions with them and give them the opportunity to explain to you what they are doing to protect health and safety.
Thank you very much, both of you, for sharing your expertise. I'm sure that's going to be very useful for LinkedIn's members.
You're welcome.
Thanks very much, Emily.